All right, so today we're diving deep into Varun Beverages,
Hmm.
PepsiCo's largest franchise bottler outside the U.S. I was reading that they even have a deal,
Oh, wow.
to manufacture and distribute Simba Munchies snacks
Really?
in Zimbabwe and Zambia.
Interesting.
But we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
First, we really need to understand, if their stock is worth a sip. We've got so much to look at. We've got financial reports, press releases, auditor reports.
Yeah,
It's going to be a fun one.
absolutely.
So let's jump right in and look at their recent performance, shall we?
Well, I think it's fascinating when you look at their performance both quarterly and annually.
Yeah.
You can see that their revenue's been consistently going up.
Really? So they're not just kind of staying afloat. They're actually
Yeah.
growing, huh?
They're growing.
That's really interesting because I know their business is kind of seasonal.
Right.
It has that ebb and flow.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have any specific numbers from their latest reports?
Yeah, so in their September 2024 report, they reported that their standalone revenue from operations was 49,320.61 million rupees.
Okay.
And then when you factor in the subsidiaries,
Yeah.
the consolidated revenue was 30,868.41 million.
Okay, so that's a lot of rupees.
It is.
What about their profit?
So for the same period,
Yeah.
standalone net profit after tax was 6,288.25 million rupees.
Okay.
And the consolidated was 4,923.38 million.
Wow. Those are some pretty impressive numbers.
Yeah, it's really good.
Now, I do remember reading that they had a stock split. Did that happen recently?
Yeah, so it happened September 2024.
Okay.
Their stock split from a 5 rupee face value to a 2 rupee face value.
Okay, so that means there are more shares available, but at a lower price per share.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So that could make it a bit more accessible to some newer investors, maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm really curious, though, what's driving all this revenue growth? Is it just the Pepsi they're bottling, or is there something else going on?
I think it's a combination of factors, but certainly their expansion strategy is playing a big role.
Oh, interesting.
They've got new production facilities popping up. We're talking Kinshasa, Gorakhpur, Khordha, and Supa.
Got it. So they're expanding, increasing their footprint.
Yeah.
That's definitely a good sign, yeah. Now, earlier you mentioned standalone and consolidated figures.
Right.
Now, for someone who's not a financial expert, can you just break that down for us? What does that really mean?
So the standalone figures are really just looking at Varun Beverages itself,
Okay.
the parent company.
Got it.
But then when you include all of their subsidiaries,
Right.
that gives you the consolidated figure.
Okay, so it's kind of like looking at the individual ingredients
Yes.
versus the whole
Exactly.
delicious meal.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, cool. So looking at their numbers,
Yeah.
what really jumps out at you?
Well, their operating profit margin, or OPM,
Okay.
is showing a really nice positive trend,
Really?
which suggests that they're getting better at managing their costs.
And squeezing more profit out of their sales.
So they're becoming more efficient.
Exactly.
That's a good sign
Absolutely.
for investors, right?
Yeah.
Now, what about their track record with dividends?
So they have been consistently paying out dividends
Really?
in recent years.
Okay, so that's good. Good for income-seeking investors, for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to switch gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about this snack venture because
ahead.
it sounds really interesting. Is that just like a side hustle for them, or is this like a serious move into a new market?
It's definitely a strategic move.
Okay.
They've got this deal with Premier Nutrition Trading, LLC, to manufacture and distribute these Simba Munchies snacks
Right.
in Zimbabwe and Zambia.
Yeah, and it starts in October 2025 for Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
April 2026 for Zambia.
Yep.
And they're actually going all in on this because they even created a new subsidiary for this, Varun Foods Zimbabwe.
That's right.
So what's the thinking behind this move beyond just having another product to sell? Well, if you connect it back to what we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
the seasonality of their beverage business,
Right.
this could help them mitigate some of that risk.
Oh, I see.
So, maybe when the weather cools down and
Yeah.
people aren't buying as much Pepsi,
Yeah.
they can munch on some Simba Munchies instead.
I like it. So it's a built-in hedge against those seasonal changes.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really smart. And this also ties in with that whole global trend, right?
Yeah,
Of more and more people wanting convenience foods and snacks.
absolutely.
So they're really tapping into a market with some serious growth potential.
For sure.
All right, so we've talked about their current performance, how they're expanding and diversifying. But let's rewind a little bit. What can we learn from their historical performance?
Well, if we look back over the last decade or so,
Yeah.
there are some really interesting patterns that emerge.
Okay, like what? Spill the tea? What kind of patterns?
Well, for starters, their sales growth, it's consistently been above 20% across different time frames,
Wow.
which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And then if you look at key metrics,
Yeah.
like return on equity, ROE,
Mm-hmm.
and return on capital employed, or ROCE,
Got it.
those have also been trending positively.
So for our listeners who don't speak fluent finance,
Sure.
can you break that down for us? What do those ratios actually mean?
Yeah, so ROE basically measures how well a company is using the money that their investors have put in
Okay.
to generate profit.
Got it.
So a higher ROE generally means they're doing a good job of rewarding their investors.
Okay.
And then ROCE looks at how well they're using all of their capital,
Okay.
not just equity, but also debt
Right.
to generate returns.
So it's a measure of their overall efficiency in utilizing their capital.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
So
So they're making good use of the money they have and keeping their investors happy.
it seems so.
That's a good combo.
Yeah.
What about their stock price? Has it been a wild ride or has it been a little bit more steady?
Historically, it's actually been a pretty steady upward trend.
Really?
Yeah, although there has been some volatility along the way, of course.
Of course, yeah. Volatility is expected with any stock.
Right.
But steady growth, that's a good sign.
Definitely.
So we've got these strong financials, ambitious expansion plans, a solid track record.
Mm-hmm.
Where does all of this leave us in terms of the investment potential here?
Well, it's important to remember that past performance doesn't guarantee future returns.
Of course.
But based on what we've seen so far, it seems like there's a lot of potential here.
Okay, so you think this is something worth looking into?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we go too deep down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I really want to kind of take a closer look at some of their specifics of their financial performance.
Sure.
I'm thinking things like their peer comparison, quarterly results, really getting into the nitty-gritty of their profit and loss statements,
Right.
balance sheets,
Yeah.
cash flow statements, all that fun stuff.
I think those are all really important areas to explore.
Okay, great. Well, let's take a quick break.
Sounds good.
We'll come back and dig into all those juicy details. Okay, so let's really get into the weeds here
Yeah.
and dissect some of these details about Varun Beverages financials.
Okay.
Starting with the peer comparison.
Right.
How do they actually stack up against other companies in the beverage industry?
Well, I think it's really important to look at the peer comparison
Yeah.
because it gives us a good sense of where they stand
Yeah.
relative to their competition.
Right.
And from what I've seen, they're actually doing really well.
Really?
They're holding their own,
Good.
and in many cases, exceeding industry averages.
So they're not just playing in the big leagues, they're competing.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really good to hear. You mentioned looking at their quarterly results.
Yes.
Why is that important?
Well, it can help us identify trends and patterns
Okay.
that might not be apparent when you're just looking at the annual numbers.
Okay, so we can see if there's any seasonality
Ex-
or any other recurring trends that might be affecting their performance.
Right, because we did talk about how their business is seasonal. So,
Right.
for example, their December quarter
Yeah.
tends to be a little weaker
Right, because of the weather.
because of the weather, yeah.
People aren't drinking as much.
Exactly.
So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at the numbers.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Now let's dive into their financial statements.
Okay.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is the profit and loss statement.
Okay, the P&L,
The P&L, exactly.
which basically tells us how much money they're making.
It shows us their revenue, their expenses,
Right.
and ultimately their profit.
So it's kind of like their report card.
Yes, exactly.
What about the balance sheet?
So the balance sheet gives us a snapshot
Okay.
of their financial position
At a specific point in time.
at a specific point in time, yes.
Okay.
So it tells us what assets they own,
Okay.
what liabilities they have, and what's left over for their shareholders, which is the equity.
Okay, so it's kind of like a financial selfie of where they stand.
Good way to put it, yeah.
Okay. And then last but not least, we have the cash flow statement.
Yes.
What's that all about?
So the cash flow statement is all about tracking the movement of cash,
Okay.
both in and out of the business.
Got it.
So we can see how much cash they're generating
Yeah.
from their operations, how much
Mhm.
they're investing,
Uh-huh.
and how they're financing those activities.
So we're following the money trail, basically,
Exactly.
making sure there are no leaks.
Right.
All right. Now, we've talked a lot about ratios. Can you just give us like a quick rundown of the key ratios that we should be paying attention to when we're looking at Varun Beverages?
Sure. So we've already mentioned a few.
Yeah, like OPM,
OPM,
ROCE.
ROCE, those are all really important.
Right.
But some other ones that are important to look at are debt to equity ratio,
Okay.
current ratio, and quick ratio,
Okay.
and inventory turnover ratio.
Okay. Now, that's a lot to take in. How do we make sense of all these numbers and these ratios?
I think the key is to look at them in context.
Okay.
Compare them over time.
Got it.
And also compare them to industry benchmarks.
Right. So we get a sense of how they're actually performing relative to everyone else.
Exactly.
So, for example, a high debt-to-equity ratio might be a red flag.
In some cases.
In some cases.
So for a company that's growing like Varun Beverages,
okay.
it might be perfectly acceptable.
As long as they're managing that debt responsibly.
Right.
Got it. Okay. What about their shareholding pattern? Who are the big players holding a stake in this company?
So their shareholding is actually a really healthy mix.
Okay.
You've got the promoters, the institutional investors, and then the public shareholders.
So it's not just a family-run business.
No.
You got big institutions and the general public all involved.
Exactly.
Okay. That's a good sign, right?
It can be, yeah. Especially when you see those big institutional investors. Right.
Because it shows they have confidence in the company.
Okay, awesome. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at their peer comparison, the quarterly trends, their financial statements.
Yeah.
We talked about ratios, shareholding patterns. Like we've done a full financial CAT scan on Varun Beverages. So what's your diagnosis?
Well, based on everything we've seen, it seems like they're in really good financial health.
Okay.
They've got a strong track record of growth.
Mm-hmm.
They're expanding strategically.
Yeah.
They're diversifying.
Right.
And they seem to be managing their finances well.
But of course, there are always risks with any investment.
Absolutely.
What are some of the potential downsides or red flags that people should be aware of?
Well, I think it's important to remember that they operate in emerging markets, which come with their own set of risks.
Yeah.
You know, there's political uncertainty, economic volatility, things like that.
So those are all things that investors need to keep in mind.
For sure. Okay. I'm sure our listeners are dying to know, based on everything you've seen, would you recommend Varun Beverages as a potential investment?
Well, it's important for me to say that I'm not a financial advisor.
Of course.
And I can't give specific investment advice.
Right.
But I can say that based on what we've discussed today, they seem to be a company that is worth considering.
Okay. So it's not a yes or no answer?
No.
But they've definitely earned a spot on our watch list.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. Now, circling back to the listener's original question.
Yes.
Which was specifically about stock investment suggestions.
Right.
What advice would you give someone who's thinking about investing in Varun Beverages?
Well, I would say use all the information that we've talked about today as a starting point. Do your own research. Look at their financial statements.
Yeah.
Explore their investor presentations.
Read those analyst reports.
Exactly.
Compare them to their competitors.
Yeah, get a really good understanding of the company.
So don't just take our word for it. Do your own homework.
Absolutely.
And make sure it aligns with your own investment goals and your risk tolerance.
Very important.
Yeah. And one more reminder, past performance is not a guarantee of future results.
Never.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to keep in mind.
If you're ever unsure, it's always a good idea to consult with a qualified financial advisor.
Absolutely.
Okay, great advice. Well, I think we've squeezed all the juice out of this conversation.
I think so.
About Varun Beverages.
I agree.
It's sort of really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
And I hope that our listeners feel like they have a better understanding of the company.
Me too.
And are now equipped to make some smart investment decisions.
Absolutely.
So, as always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, happy investing.
Okay, so we've been talking about Varun Beverages and really diving into their financials and their growth strategy.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to step back and look at the bigger picture, right?
Yeah. You know, what kind of external factors could affect their future?
Well, that's a really crucial point because while we've been focusing on their internal strengths and their strategy, it's important to remember that they operate in a global landscape.
Right.
And particularly in emerging markets, which come with their own set of opportunities and challenges.
Okay. Yeah, you've mentioned these emerging markets a few times.
Right.
What makes them so different from, say, established markets like the U.S. or Europe?
Well, I think one of the key differences is the pace of change.
Okay.
Emerging markets often experience rapid economic growth.
Okay.
And, consumer trends are evolving constantly.
Right.
And the regulatory environment can be pretty dynamic.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty challenging environment to navigate,
It can be.
but also potentially very rewarding.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a high risk, high reward kind of scenario.
Okay. Can you give us some specific examples of these external factors that investors should be thinking about?
Sure. So geopolitical events are always a factor. Things like political instability or changes in government policies. Those can have a real impact on businesses operating in those regions.
Right, and then currency fluctuations.
Yes, absolutely. Big swings in exchange rates can affect profitability.
Yeah, make it hard to predict how much money they'll actually make.
Right, and that makes it harder for our investors to make informed decisions.
Okay. What about the competitive landscape? I mean, they are the largest PepsiCo bottler outside the U.S., but I imagine they face competition.
Oh, absolutely. The beverage industry is incredibly competitive.
Yeah.
They're going up against global giants like Coca-Cola, for example.
Right.
And then they also have to compete with local and regional players.
So they need to stay on top of their game to maintain their market share.
Absolutely.
Now, we can't forget about the global economic climate
Yeah.
either, right?
Yeah, that's a huge factor.
Because things like inflation, rising interest rates,
Yeah.
supply chain disruptions,
Yeah.
all of those things can impact a business like Varun Beverages, right? Like rising input costs would cut into their profit margins.
Exactly.
And supply chain issues could disrupt their production and distribution.
Right.
And then if the economy weakens and people are spending less,
Yeah, consumer demand could take a hit.
right, it's all connected.
It really is. It's like a complex web of factors that are always in motion.
So for someone who's thinking about investing in Varun Beverages, what are your key takeaways?
I think the most important thing is to remember that investing, especially in emerging markets, requires a balanced approach.
Okay.
Don't get caught up in the hype or short-term market fluctuation.
Right, take that long-term perspective.
Exactly. Do your research, look at their fundamentals.
Understand the risks.
Yeah, understand both the potential risks and the potential rewards.
Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I'd say stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions.
I love it. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive on Varun Beverages.
Yeah.
We've really covered a lot of ground today.
It's been great.
I hope our listeners feel like they've got a better grasp on the company, the industry, and the factors that could influence their investment decisions.
I hope so too.
As always, thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, happy investing.